You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you simply vanish. You stop replying to messages, cancel plans, make up excuses not to leave the house. And when someone asks what happened, you can't explain. Because how do you say that you woke up one day and felt like you don't belong anywhere? How do you explain that all conversations feel like theater, that all smiles seem like masks, and that you're exhausted from pretending everything is okay when, inside, something is quietly falling apart? This isn't a conscious decision you make. It's more like something inside you just disconnects from the world, as if a switch is flipped and suddenly you're watching your own life through foggy glass. You see people continuing their routines, laughing, making plans, living as if nothing has changed, while you're there, physically present but absent in every other way that matters. And the most painful part is that no one understands. To the outside world, you've just become antisocial, lazy, or worse, ungrateful. After all, you have friends, family, people who care. Why are you isolating yourself? Why don't you respond? Why can't you just get out of bed and participate in life like everyone else can? But they don't understand that you're not choosing this. You're being consumed by something much greater and more complex than a simple desire to be alone. What you're experiencing has a name in psychology. And no, it's not ordinary depression or social anxiety, although it might feel that way. It's something researchers call adaptive emotional disconnection, a deeply unconscious protective mechanism that your brain activates when it detects that the emotional environment around you has become unsustainable or potentially harmful. Think of your nervous system as a hypersensitive security device. It's constantly scanning the environment for danger signals, not just physical but emotional. When it detects that social interactions are costing more energy than they're providing, when it perceives that you are constantly performing a version of yourself that isn't authentic, when it registers that you're being consistently misunderstood or minimized, it does the only thing it knows to do to protect you. It disconnects you. This process doesn't happen at a conscious level. It's orchestrated by your limbic system, the most primitive and intuitive part of your brain, which has only one function: to ensure your emotional survival. And for that part of you, surviving sometimes means withdrawing completely from the social battlefield, even if it means being alone with your thoughts and feelings for an indefinite period of time. Neuroscience shows us that when we are in a state of chronic emotional overload, our prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for social decision-making and motivation, literally reduces its activity. It's as if your brain is conserving energy, prioritizing only the functions essential for basic survival. That's why you can no longer enjoy the things that used to motivate you. That's why replying to a simple message feels like a Herculean task. It's not laziness, it's your brain in preservation mode. But why do some people develop this disconnection pattern while others don't? The answer lies in the deeper layers of your emotional history, in patterns that were established long before you were aware they existed. If you're someone who disappears out of nowhere, you probably learned very early on that your emotional needs were inconvenient to those around you. Maybe you grew up in an environment where expressing vulnerability was seen as weakness, where your emotions were constantly minimized or ignored, where you had to become the easy child, the friend who never caused trouble, the person who always seemed fine. You developed an extraordinary ability to read other people's emotions and adapt to them, often at the cost of losing touch with your own. You became an expert at giving people what they wanted to see, at being the version of yourself that would be accepted and loved. But this performative version of yourself is exhausting to maintain because it requires you to constantly monitor others' reactions and adjust your behavior accordingly. Carl Jung described this as the creation of a persona, a social mask we use to navigate the world. But for people like you, the persona became so dominant that you lost touch with who you really are underneath it. And when that happens, when you can no longer sustain the performance, when the mask becomes too heavy to carry, your nervous system does the only thing it can. It removes you from the entire situation. Isolation becomes a refuge where you can finally stop performing, where you can exist without having to be anything for anyone. But it's also a haunted place, because when you remove all the masks, what remains is sometimes a terrifying void, the sense that you no longer know who you are when you're not being what others need you to be. This pattern becomes even more complex when you consider that you are likely a naturally empathetic person, perhaps even hypersensitive. You absorb other people's emotions like a sponge, carrying not just your own feelings, but also the unprocessed feelings of everyone you interact with. Your nervous system is constantly overwhelmed by emotional data that isn't yours, but that you process as if it were. The root of this pattern can almost always be traced back to childhood experiences, where you learned that your authentic presence wasn't welcome or was conditional. Maybe you grew up with emotionally unavailable parents who only paid attention to you when you were being good, or when you were tending to their emotional needs. Maybe you were the child who had to grow up too fast, who became the family's emotional caregiver, who learned that love meant sacrificing your own needs for others. Or maybe your trauma was more subtle, what psychologists call developmental trauma. You weren't overtly abused or neglected, but your fundamental emotional needs weren't consistently met. You learned that to be loved, you had to be convenient. To be accepted, you had to be easy. To belong, you had to hide the parts of you that were too intense, too sensitive, or too different. That child you once were developed an internal alert system that constantly monitors signs of rejection. You become hyper-vigilant to changes in people's tone of voice, to microsignals of irritation or disapproval. You develop an almost supernatural ability to predict when you're becoming too much for someone, and you withdraw before the rejection happens. The problem is that this alert system becomes so sensitive that it detects danger where none exists. A delayed reply to a message becomes evidence that you annoyed the person. A slightly different tone of voice becomes proof that you're being rejected. And when those false alarms accumulate, when you constantly feel on the verge of being abandoned or misunderstood, the only solution your brain can find is to completely withdraw from the situation. The digital age has intensified this pattern in ways we don't fully understand. Your brain, which evolved to handle small groups and face-to-face interactions, now has to process hundreds of superficial social interactions through screens. Every notification is a small stimulus to your social alert system. Every like, every comment, every message is a micro event that your primitive brain must evaluate in terms of acceptance or rejection. For someone with a hypersensitive nervous system, this constant overload of digital social stimuli can be devastating. You find yourself obsessively checking if people have seen your messages, analyzing how long they take to reply, interpreting the tone of text messages that have no tone at all. Your brain is in a constant state of social anxiety, even when you're physically alone. The phenomenon of disappearing out of nowhere becomes almost inevitable in this context. Your nervous system simply can't process the amount of social data it's receiving anymore. It's as if you've reached your maximum human connection capacity, and the only way to avoid a total breakdown is to temporarily disconnect from everything. Social media makes it even worse because it reinforces the tendency to perform an edited version of yourself. You post only the good moments, the photos where you look happy, the thoughts that sound smart or interesting. You become addicted to external validation, but at the same time feel increasingly disconnected from your real internal experience, which is inevitably more complex and confusing than anything you could post. When you disappear, you're essentially doing a digital and social detox, giving your nervous system a chance to regulate itself again. You're stopping the cycle of performance and validation that was consuming all your emotional energy. If something within you is recognizing this description, if you feel seen in a way that rarely happens, that's no coincidence. You've probably spent most of your life feeling like a stranger in your own existence, like someone constantly trying to decipher the rules of a game that everyone else seems to understand instinctively except you. But here's something maybe no one has told you. Your sensitivity is not a flaw. Your tendency to absorb other people's emotions is not a weakness. Your need to retreat when the world becomes too much is not a character defect. These are signs that you have a nervous system that processes reality more deeply and intensely than the average person. The problem was never that you were too much. The problem was that you were raised in environments that were not enough, places that had no room for the fullness of who you are, that required you to shrink yourself to fit into expectations that were never made for people like you. When you disappear, you're not running away from life. You're trying to find a space where you can exist without constantly having to translate your inner experience into a language others can understand. You're looking for a moment of peace where you don't have to be anything other than exactly who you are in that moment, with all the complexity, confusion, and intensity that involves. The solitude you seek isn't empty, it's full of yourself. And it might be the first time in a long time that you've been allowed to fully occupy the space of your own existence without apologizing for it. You are not broken for needing to disappear sometimes. You're not being dramatic for feeling that the world is too intense. You're not being antisocial for needing long periods of silence to reconnect with who you truly are beneath all the expectations and performances. You're being human in a way that few people have the courage to be completely, intensely, unapologetically. And yes, that means sometimes you'll need to vanish. You'll need spaces where you don't have to explain why you feel things so deeply, why you need to process life in slow motion, why you can't just get over things at the speed the world demands. If you're reading this from your own refuge, from your own period of disconnection, know that you are not lost. You are finding yourself. And when you're ready in your time, in your way, you'll emerge from that silence, not as the performative version of yourself the world is used to seeing, but as something much rarer and more precious, your true self, without translations. Because in the end, the people who truly matter will understand that sometimes you need to disappear in order to return whole. And those who don't understand probably were never your people to begin with. If you see yourself in these words, write "I disappear too" in the comments. You are not alone in this journey back to yourself.